Let's talk about what happens when a super empath steps into the emotional orbit of an avoidant. There's something almost electric about that interaction, something that cuts through layers of defense that most people never even notice. You see, avoidants survive through control, controlling their space, their emotions, and most of all, the proximity of others to their inner world. Their nervous system has been trained to associate closeness with danger, so the moment they feel someone drawing near, their instinct is to retreat. That retreat is their safety. But here's where it gets interesting. A super empath doesn't chase, doesn't demand, doesn't even try to get in. They simply remain present, unshaken. And that presence is exactly what dismantles the avoidance armor. Think about how rare that is in our world. Most people respond to emotional distance with their own version of distance, hurt feelings, withdrawal, or confrontation. But a super empath doesn't react, they respond. They stay centered, they keep showing up with calm energy, even when the other person pushes them away. That consistency short-circuits the avoidance usual pattern. Suddenly, their defenses, which are designed to keep chaos out, start creating chaos within. Because what do you do when the very thing you're afraid of, genuine closeness, is being offered to you without pressure or judgment? The avoidant mind has no script for that. And when the mind has no script, control begins to slip at a psychological level. What's happening here is a disruption of the avoidance threat response system. Avoidants are constantly scanning for danger and intimacy, primed to interpret emotional closeness as a potential loss of autonomy or safety. But a super empath's presence doesn't trigger those familiar cues. It's not threatening, not overwhelming, not emotionally chaotic. It's steady like emotional still water that confuses the avoidance nervous system. Their body expects to feel trapped, but instead it feels safe. And that safety is terrifying because it bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the core of who they are, the part they've been protecting all along. On a deeper philosophical level, this is about truth. Avoidants spend much of their emotional life in a kind of exile from themselves, protecting their vulnerability as if it's something dangerous. Super empaths walk straight past that illusion. They don't try to tear down the walls. They simply sit outside them, waiting until the walls start to feel unnecessary. And when those walls begin to dissolve, all the emotions buried behind them start to rise. That's not something an avoidant can control. They can't choose which emotions surface. They can't stop the memories, the longings, the unhealed wounds that come rushing up. That's why they often feel like they're losing control around super empaths. It's not that the empath is doing anything to them. It's that the empath's presence makes it safe enough for the truth to finally come out. And truth is powerful. It doesn't knock on the door. It kicks it wide open. This is the paradox. What feels like losing control is actually the first step toward real emotional freedom. The avoidant doesn't see that at first. They only feel the storm. But underneath that storm is something they've been craving their entire lives. Genuine connection that doesn't demand they stop being who they are, but invites them to become who they've always been. And that's the quiet revolution a super empath begins, not by force, but by presence. Because nothing disarms fear faster than love that refuses to flinch. One of the most disorienting things for an avoidant when they encounter a super empath is the way they feel completely seen, almost exposed, without having said a single word. It's as if the empath is holding up a mirror they didn't agree to look into. Now, this isn't about mind reading or some mystical gift. It's about deep attunement. Super empaths have spent their lives noticing the subtleties others miss, the micro shifts in tone, the tension behind a smile, the flicker of pain behind someone's eyes. They don't just hear what's being said, they hear what's being avoided. And for an avoidant whose entire emotional strategy depends on staying hidden, that kind of perception feels like standing under a spotlight with nowhere to run. This is where the dynamic starts to shake. Avoidants build their identity around control over what they show, what they reveal, and what stays locked inside. They operate from the belief that if people really saw them, they would either be judged, rejected, or consumed. So they become masters at concealment, carefully curating how much of themselves the world gets to witness. But a super empath doesn't ask for the mask to come off, they simply see through it. And that creates a seismic disruption. Because when someone sees you more clearly than you've ever allowed yourself to be seen, the old rules stop working. The walls you've relied on to protect you suddenly become transparent. From a psychological standpoint, this is about the threat of involuntary vulnerability. Avoidants carry deep-seated schemas, mental frameworks that equate vulnerability with danger. Their nervous system is wired to respond to exposure the way most people respond to physical threat with fight, flight, or freeze. But an empath's mirror bypasses the usual defenses. It doesn't confront, it reflects. It doesn't accuse, it simply illuminates. And that's what makes it so destabilizing. The avoidant feels their inner world surfacing against their will. Emotions they've buried begin to rise. Parts of themselves they've denied start clamoring for attention. They don't want this to happen, and yet they can't stop it. That loss of emotional containment is what makes them feel like they're spiraling. On a deeper level, this isn't just about being seen by another person. It's about being forced to see themselves. That is the real trigger. Most avoidants have spent years, even decades, organizing their lives to avoid looking too closely at their own emotional landscape. They fear what they might find, the grief, the longing, the unhealed wounds. But a super empath's gaze reflects all of it back, gently but unmistakably, like a mirror you can't turn away from. And once you've seen yourself in that mirror, you can't unsee it. That's why the presence of a super empath can feel both terrifying and magnetic at once. They awaken the truth, and the truth won't go back to sleep. And here's the paradox. They fear that if someone truly sees them, they'll lose control, when in reality, being truly seen is the first moment they ever have a chance to be free. Because you can't heal what you're still hiding from. You can't choose who you want to become if you're still pretending to be someone you're not. The mirror doesn't break you. It reveals you. And once you've been revealed, you have a choice: run from it or rise into it. Avoidants often navigate relationships like a game of emotional chess. Every move is calculated, every piece placed to maintain distance, to preserve their sense of control. They've learned that staying one step ahead emotionally keeps them safe. And in most dynamics, it works. They create just enough closeness to keep someone engaged and just enough distance to keep themselves protected. It's a delicate balance that gives them a quiet sense of power, a belief that they can manage the terms of connection. But when a super empath steps into that equation, that entire power structure starts to crumble, because empaths don't play the game. They change the board. Here's the shift: an avoidant expects emotional pursuit. They anticipate that if they pull back, the other person will chase, protest, or attempt to negotiate for closeness. That reaction affirms their belief that they are in control of the emotional tempo. But a super empath doesn't chase. They simply remain open, present, and emotionally anchored regardless of what the avoidant does. And that confuses the avoidant's nervous system. There's no tug of war, no resistance to push against, no conflict to fuel their withdrawal. Instead, they're met with a calm steadiness that can't be manipulated. And that's when their internal structure starts to collapse, because the entire dynamic they depend on to feel safe no longer works. At a psychological level, this dismantles what's known as the distance, intimacy, control loop. Avoidants operate in a cycle. Closeness triggers fear. Fear triggers withdrawal. Withdrawal restores their sense of control, and control brings temporary calm. But the empath breaks that loop. When the avoidant withdraws, the empath doesn't react with protest or desperation. They simply stay grounded. That denies the avoidant the familiar payoff of regaining control through distance. Suddenly, the avoidant isn't in charge of the rhythm anymore. The emotional power they're used to wielding evaporates, and with it goes their sense of safety. What's left is raw exposure, which they mistake for chaos. There's also a philosophical tension here. Avoidants believe connection is a risk, something that must be carefully rationed to prevent harm. Super empaths live from the opposite premise, that connection isn't something you control, it's something you allow. That difference in worldview creates a quiet revolution inside the avoidant. Their usual tactics, emotional detachment, ambiguity, strategic silence, don't work on someone who isn't trying to win, but simply trying to be. And when control stops working, fear surges to the surface. Not because the empath is threatening, but because they've removed the illusion of power the avoidant depends on. They strip away the armor by refusing to engage in battle. What the avoidant doesn't realize, at least not at first, is that the moment they lose control is also the moment they touch something real. When they're no longer managing the connection, they start experiencing it. It's overwhelming, it's terrifying, and it's the very thing they've been longing for beneath all the defenses. This is why they often feel like they're coming apart around super empaths, because the part of them that craves control is colliding with the part of them that craves love. And love will always expose control as an illusion. There's a deeper layer to this dynamic that often gets overlooked when an avoidant is around a super empath. They are not just reacting to that person's presence, they are colliding with their own unresolved past. And that collision is what makes them feel like they're spinning out of control. See, avoidants didn't wake up one day and decide closeness was dangerous. That belief was forged in pain, usually early on when vulnerability was met with rejection, chaos, or neglect. They built their emotional world on the foundation of self-protection because they had to. It wasn't a flaw, it was survival. But when a super empath steps into their orbit, they awaken something ancient, the part of the avoidant that still longs to be held understood and loved without condition. And that awakening shakes the entire structure they've built to keep those longings buried. This isn't just emotional, it's physiological. The body keeps score. The nervous system stores those old imprints of fear and loss like scars beneath the surface. And when the avoidant senses safety in the empath's presence, the body assumes it's finally time to release what's been stored, memories, grief, longing, they start to rise like waves. It feels uncontrollable because, in a way, it is. Trauma that has been suppressed for years does not surface politely, it erupts. And the avoidant, who has spent their life staying detached to avoid exactly that eruption, suddenly finds themselves flooded with emotions they don't have the tools to regulate. That emotional flood feels like drowning. But what's really happening is something profound. Their system is trying to heal. On a psychological level, this is the moment when the old narrative cracks. The avoidance story has always been that vulnerability equals danger. That letting anyone too close will only lead to pain. But here stands the super empath, close enough to touch the core wounds without harming them, close enough to see their darkness without flinching. That directly contradicts everything the avoidant has believed about relationships. And the mind doesn't let go of a survival belief easily, so it fights, it pushes the empath away, it manufactures reasons to run, not because the empath has done anything wrong, but because the mind is trying to protect the self from change. And change, even when it's healing, feels like loss to the part of us that's rooted in fear. There's also a philosophical truth playing out here. The human heart is designed for connection, and anything built in opposition to that will eventually collapse under its own weight. The avoidant has spent their life trying to outrun their own need for love. The super empath quietly hands them what they've been running from. That's why they lose control, because they're not just facing another person, they're facing themselves. And you can't outrun what lives inside you. The very thing they fear being cracked open is the doorway to becoming whole.